Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and my good friend Deb Romero is here, certified Alexander Technique instructor. So today's topic is on spurs and whips. Woohoo!
Yeehaw.
Spurs and whips, because they are actual training tools. They can work, but I think if we know how they work, what the purpose
Yeah.
is, how they dynamically influence the horse's movement, helps us make more educated choices about number one, whether we need them, or number two, which one we need, whether we should go with spurs or whips. And I find most people gravitate to spurs for two reasons. There's a specific way to hold the riding whip that makes it lighter and easier to use, but most people don't know that. So holding a riding whip is often cumbersome to the rider, especially the long dressage whip. So the spurs just seem
Mhm.
easier, right? And I think the other reason is people just feel cool wearing spurs. I
It's
think
like
it's like,
watching the old cowboy western movies and hearing the shoes, the boots, and the spurs, ka-ching,
yeah,
ka-ching, ka-ching.
if you ride Western, it's definitely cool to wear spurs. And even if you ride English with the little spurs, it's like, I don't know, there's sort of a professional level. If you're wearing spurs on your boots, you just seem more professional. And I go, really, it's become more of a fashion accessory.
Mm,
So,
yep,
full disclosure, I never use spurs. I'm not a fan.
me either. I was
And
just thinking about it, and we can get into it later, but how when we add devices of any kind, how does that change our use of our own bodies?
it makes the use of our own bodies quite lazy. And I
Yeah.
find oftentimes if we're going to leveraged bits and head setting devices and spurs, a whip is a little different. And we'll talk about that. But it's like if we're going to those things, we're probably not very well balanced or organized as a rider, or our horse has big balance issues. It's a bigger
Mm.
problem than just a lack of forward that we feel we need to ride with spurs all the time.
Because I think that in my mind, because I many years ago rode with spurs, but I didn't have the training I have now, that totally changes my thought process on how to educate the horse to move forward.
Yeah, and on a dynamic level, which means how we use our body or tools has a direct effect on the horse's balance or forces of
Hmm.
motion or mechanical coordination. That's what's a dynamic aid. And with spurs, one of the biggest drawbacks, especially um, when you're using them for forward, which they're,
Hmm.
by the way, not intended for forward aids, but because they connect to our feet, people automatically think spurs equal a forward tool, and it's not.
Exactly.
But in order to actually use the spur, we have to adjust our leg bones so much to even touch the horse with the spur that we're going to destabilize our seat in order to reach the horse's flank with the spur on our heel. You have to destabilize your seat in order to use a spur. And I go, that unstable seat of the rider is making forward more and more and more difficult for the horse. So
That's a really good point. And
it's a,
it's thinking in isolation too, thinking that that one part of my body is going to get forward or a yield of any kind.
right,
Thinking in isolation like that, I don't think is a good thing because like you said, it completely destabilizes the rest of the body.
right. No, and spurs and originally, if you go back to when dressage was actually warfare, a spur could get your horse to jump sideways, right? Faster than the sword could pierce you or the horse. That would be a pretty useful use of the spurs. So it's better if you spur your horse to jump sideways before the sword can reach you of your opponent, then you're going to save your life and your horse's life. Okay, I would use a spur for that,
Yeah,
right?
if
It's
that
a
ever
lot,
comes up.
if that ever comes up, I would put on spurs. Yeah. If I have to go into battle, spurs might be really useful. If I'm not actually having a life-threatening situation, the spurs, and again, based on sort of the old, archaic, disproven now understanding that the horse's spine should bend laterally during lateral work or on a circle, then the spurs were also a way to encourage a lateral bend in the horse's spine, right? But
Mm,
regarding forward, number one, the spurs are in the wrong place. They're going to
mhm.
stimulate the lower barrel of the horse, which is not where they're going to initiate forward, right?
Good
And
point.
number two, if we're creating a pain issue, then of course the horse is going to sort of bend the spine away from that spur, left or right. But like the paper we went over by Jean-Marie Denois, many, many, many episodes again, it was one of our earlier
Yes.
episodes, it really talks about lateral bending and rotation and how we don't want excessive lateral bending of the horse's spine on a circle or during lateral work, because that will actually create dysfunctional twisting or rotation issues in the horse's spine. And so you won't ever easily lift the horse's back or actually make the horse more athletic by doing that. And that's what spurs can really encourage. And people
Mm.
also think spurs are for stimulating the abdominal muscles, which they're
Oh my God.
in lifts the back. And I go,
Wow.
so spurs are not for forward, and the abdominal muscles don't lift the back, right? The back muscles where we're sitting lift the back. So if we're
Hmm.
using spurs, and if we use the spur for lateral bending, we're likely going to get excessive lateral bending. So that's
In the
why
horse,
in the horse,
in the
yeah.
spine. Okay.
So I go, there's too many drawbacks, not enough benefits, right? And if we also go back to that podcast episode we did on Umwelt,
Hmm.
I forget the author's name. Oof, I have to look it up, but it talks about the horse's level of sensitivity, especially where our legs go around the horse's barrel. The horse's level of skin sensitivity is higher than what we can measure on the human fingertip.
Mm.
So that's pretty sensitive. So I go, why would I need a spur? My horse is highly sensitive there. And then
Yes.
somebody goes, yeah, but not my horse. My horse is dull, right? It's like trying to move a two by four. And I go, well, because of the sensitivity level that's inherent, if we're using spurs, then you imagine the overwhelm to their sensory perceptions. They're going to shut it off. And
I
then
was
you
just thinking that, and I've seen some horses back up or, do a lot of different things other than
go
what
forward.
they go forward.
Yeah. And spurs are not intended for forward,
Hmm.
right? And jockeys don't use them, number one, because they're not an effective forward tool. That's not how they work with the horse's perceptions dynamically. And number two, jockeys who want their horse to go fast are stabilizing by basically their only leg contact is around their ankles and feet.
Hmm.
They're up above the movement, stabilizing their bodies, creating an open channel, like an open corridor for the flow of that river of force to just run through them. So if we want to increase speed, we want to open the channel for the hindquarters to push that energy through us, right? And with spurs, we're stimulating left-right directions of force at best, right?
Hmm.
Or we're overwhelming the horse's sensitivity to our leg aid. So the horse becomes more and more dull to our leg aid. So if we're using spurs for forward, it's more like we're pushing that forward flow of energy. We're pushing it to the left bank and the right bank, or we're squeezing it
Mm.
inward with both
That's what I
legs.
was thinking, the thought of the whole use of the leg becomes inappropriate at that point because we're isolating with our thinking of what the spurs are supposed to help us to do.
Right. That we think it's a condition response,
Yes.
right? Where our legs actually work dynamically to resist the current speed.
Mm-hmm.
So when we strengthen our calf muscle or we squeeze in lightly with our calf lower leg bones, what we're doing is we're making the halt uncomfortable for the horse. But they have to initiate movement from the hindquarter.
Right. So we're almost shutting it off,
Yeah,
you
we're
know,
we're squeezing it together
yeah, we're shutting off the connection from the hind end traveling towards the front.
of energy. Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 And so
Because
the
we're,
harder
yeah.
we use our legs, the more we're actually sort of squeezing the spigot of energy.
Hmm.
We're making it harder for the hindquarter, the thrust of the hindquarter. So the hind leg in the pushing phase is what generates the forward flow of motion. The hindquarter does. Then it travels through the barrel, which is where we sit, and then it goes out the front. That's the forward direction of motion in the horse. So if we're squeezing in hard with our legs or we're using spurs, kind of pushing the energy sideways, it no longer has room to come forward.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me.
Yeah. So
And
whether,
some of the horses completely, like I said, completely, I've seen them completely shut down and go backwards.
yeah, or they just like shut
They're
down,
overwhelmed.
either overwhelmed, and again, because of that skin sensitivity, they're easily overwhelmed even by a hard leg without a spur.
That's true.
Like I'll oftentimes put my hand, the palm of my hand, between the horse's barrel and the rider's calf,
Hmm.
and I go, show me your leg aid. And I've had some riders like, I'm like, yikes, that hurt my hand. Like
Oh my
that was
gosh.
pretty powerful what we can do with our lower legs. And I go, no, just tighten the calf muscle,
Hmm.
right? Just a little bit. The horse will hear that. And if they've shut down, that lighter sort of tapping reawakens their sensitivity
Hmm.
on the barrel. But it's just like how we shut down if you get one of those super manly handshakes with somebody just squeezing your hand into oblivion. You're like, ooh, you kind of either want to recoil from that or get
Yeah,
away
that's what
from
I
it.
would do.
Yeah. Yeah. Or if they won't let go of your hand, you're like, okay, don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't think
There's
about
that, there's that.
it.
We talk about it as body workers, that little bit of resistance or rub when it's not met evenly. You know what I'm saying? The energy is not, this energy is a bigger force or a lesser force. It's not meeting in the middle kind of thing.
So yeah, like the way I would explain that, I'm sure it happens all the time with body workers or putting hands on people,
Hmm.
but it's sort of like we don't like a handshake that's too strong or too soft.
Right.
It gives us a creepy feeling.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe what the horses are going through when we, apply an over aid,
Yeah,
uh, overdue. And I think we've talked about this before. We as humans are usually speaking way too loudly or aggressively, and I don't mean verbally, but just with our body language towards a horse, that they're just much more sensitive than we give them credit for.
yeah. And I push back against the myth or the mythology around horse whisperers all the time because I go, a horse whisperer isn't magical. They're just working at this subtle level of
Hmm.
communication that horses actually respond to best.
They get that.
They get that. They're highly sensitive. And in that Umwelt paper we reviewed, it was like a really keen sense of smell, hearing things that are out of the range of frequency that the human ear can hear, and a skin sensitivity level that's more than our fingertips.
Mhm.
And so their whole way of perceiving the world is a level of sensitivity where we have to bring it down a
Mhm.
couple of notches. And that's
Yes.
what makes it look magical is once the human figures out how subtle it really needs to be to have a nonverbal dialogue with a horse, it's so subtle to our perception that it looks like magic.
Mhm.
I go, it's not magic. It's just a very subtle nonverbal
Mhm.
communication that it takes years for the human to figure out, but the horses, that's their mode of communicating. So yeah,
Yeah.
we can easily overwhelm them with harsh rein aids and strong bits. And to me, that's what spurs do. It's unnecessary, especially for forward. It's just too much force.
Mhm.
And Jean-Luc Cornille, I was really relieved when I worked with him because he's, really up there, classical type writer who specializes in biomechanics. And he didn't care for spurs either. I was so relieved to find a high level rider who didn't ever find the need for spurs. And he would say to people who say, well, I really don't use the spurs, but my horse knows if they're on. And my horse will go
Interesting.
forward if I just ride with them. Or I use them very lightly. I have very good leg control, so I never use them harshly. And he goes, okay, give me your fingertip, and I'm only going to poke you with a needle very lightly. And let's see. I'm just going to poke you really
Just a
lightly
little.
with a needle in your fingertip, and we'll see what you think about that. And he was more adamant. He's like, that is what we're doing with spurs. It's like poking our fingertips with a needle. And that really stuck with me because I'm like, that's kind of hard to forget.
Mhm.
And if you really realize the sensitivity, the spurs, and not only are they dynamically pushing the forces of emotion the wrong direction, but they're overwhelming, making a horse recoil from our leg rather
Right.
than, just getting the idea that we're resisting the halt or we're resisting the walk or to get the trot.
Yeah. And that thought of isolating that that's what makes the horse go, just completely up unbalances the rider, which makes it harder for the horse.
Yeah. So the way to build more forward energy in a horse is to reduce dissipation of forces left to right.
Right.
To get the horse straighter and straighter through the midline is going to channel any energy that's generated by the hind legs through the barrel straight out the front. You're making the forces of motion more and more and more efficient.
Right.
So that dissipation of energy left to right, if we're using spurs, we're asking the horse to push energy left to right.
Mhm.
And by the way, we're going to have to destabilize our seat to get the spur in
Yes.
contact with the barrel. So now we're pushing the upper back forces left and right, right?
Mhm.
So then even if the horse is pushing forward from the hindquarters, which is where the motion has to come from, the force of motion, it can't get through the barrel without sloshing left and right.
Around. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at jockeys, jockeys carry a whip. And what do they do with the whip? There's actually, you practice how to use your whip as a racing jockey so that in the moment you're touching the horse, you're touching the hindquarters. You're
Mhm.
never touching the flank, even behind your leg. You're reaching back all the way to the hindquarters, saying, more push, more push, more push. That's how the horse receives that nonverbal communication to increase pushing force, is a tap on the hindquarter. That's why a whip is a far superior tool because the whip it doesn't have to sting or hurt the horse. It's more like if I tap you on your shoulder from behind, where does your attention go?
Right.
It goes
Mhm.
right to where my finger touched your shoulder.
Mhm.
And that's the sort of what they call proprioceptive stimulation. So it doesn't have to be, I don't have to whack you on the back to get your attention, although I could.
You could.
I just have to
I
lightly,
might bite.
you might bite or kick. I might get bucked off. Um, but all I had to do to get your attention was just tap you on the shoulder. And that's what we're doing with a whip, ideally, is just having the physical ability, because our arms might not be long enough, although we can reach back, and I'll do it if I don't have a whip in my hand. Once I've given a light leg aid, if the horse hasn't responded, I need to stimulate the hindquarters and say, push from here.
Hmm.
Create for more forward motion, more forward energy, or start the movement from here. So the whip is just a way to help us keep our seat and our upper leg really stable so that once that forward energy begins to flow from the hindquarter, we're now channeling it straight forward through the barrel.
Yeah.
And we're minimizing dissipation left and right with our seat and our upper leg.
It's a whole nother way of thinking of going forward. You're the human is actually thinking the movement has to come from the hind end if they're using the whip properly, instead of, like you said, with the spurs, it's just cutting everything off. Here, at least you're thinking that, yes, the energy has to come from back to front.
Yes, you're
And I like that a
channeling it.
lot better. Yeah.
Yeah. So the lower leg, just a calf squeeze, is a bit of a conditioned response, right?
Hmm.
It on a sensitive horse, it can be uncomfortable enough just when we don't even move our leg bones inward, lower leg bones. All we do is tighten the calf muscle. On a sensitive horse, that can be enough to make them uncomfortable at halt and explore forward.
Right.
So when I'm teaching a green horse to be ridden, they don't have a leg aid,
Right.
but they don't, I have to teach them the leg aid to go forward.
Right.
So I lightly tighten the calf muscle. And if I don't feel the impulse to move, right, then I can tap the hindquarter with my fingers or the whip, or I could move my leg bones in ever so slightly. But if I move my lower leg bones inward to squeeze the horse, I can only go about an inch before my seat becomes unstable.
I was going to say, then what if it's, as humans, what we do is we don't maintain the same frequency. We keep adding,
Yes.
which,
We get harder,
is
harder,
kind of like,
harder,
well,
harder.
I'll take 10 aspirin instead of one
Yeah.
theory,
If if one's good, 10
if
must be
one's got,
better.
yeah, and I see that with riders and people just, I've got to work harder, it's got to be more, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, and that's where understanding the research on horses' body helps us work more effectively.
Hmm.
And that's exactly it. If our way of thinking, which might even be subconscious until you guys are
Mm.
listening to this podcast, but the way of thinking in traditional riding is forward comes from the legs, from the rider's
Right,
legs, right? So what do
right.
you do if you drive? You never drive a cart without a whip, right?
This,
You never. The whip is your leg aid.
and we- there's a level of communication when you're driving, that there is the connection with the reins, but there's also an energetic frequency of getting the horse to move forward. And I think we forget that as riders. We go back to the thinking that it's got to be my leg, or it's got to be this huge movement. And just from the years of working with you, it's a very subtle thought, whole body thing that happens. It's not in isolation at all for me anymore.
Yeah. And the subtleness is like I'll ask people just on the ground. We're going to start at halt. And what happens right before you take the first step into the walk? And there's that whole energetic change
Hmm.
before our foot actually moves. And I
Hmm.
go, that's really my first aid for forward on a horse.
Right.
I don't know how we do it, but we can all do it. And so if
Well,
we
yeah. The thought
pause,
always comes before the action, and I don't think people. realize that. And we have, as we've talked about many podcasts, our habits of thinking that if you think it, your body will take on that pattern pretty quickly.
Yeah. And it happens so fast and it's so subtle that we have no idea what happens right before we decide to take that first step,
Hmm.
right? Or even as we're talking, we're both sitting, we both move around a lot when we
I'm on
talk.
a ball. That's why I'm moving around. I'm on my ball, my bouncy ball.
Yeah, and so it's like even before you shift on the ball, there's a little like a little something that happens before the
Hmm.
movement happens,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? And that's what I talk about regarding forces of motion. We're changing the forces of motion, and the physical body follows that. So
Yeah.
when I'm stable as a rider in my seat and torso, the horse can perceive that intention, that
Hmm.
little tiny wave of energy as if I were going to walk off myself without a single
Yes.
physical gesture. The horse will perceive just that.
Yes. And
That's
I
what,
think that's that horse whisperer category,
yes,
that it's that level of
subtlety.
work. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's just so, like I said, we are pretty much screaming at them. Um, if I can see an aid, that's screaming to me.
Yeah, and when I first started learning to colt start or get young horses ridden for the first time, I even expected all green or young horses in their first dozen rides are going to buck or rear or bolt or have shenanigans, and you just had to be this sort of bold daredevil to ride young horses. And one of my British mentors pointed out to me, that's an American thing.
Ah,
We've been backing horses for generations without the
all of
bucking,
that.
rearing, bolting. And she goes, it's really about teaching the four primary aids: go, whoa, turn left, turn right, and quietly allowing the horse to find stability with a rider on
Yeah.
board. Because as soon as you sit on a horse that's never been ridden, I don't care the breed or the age, they stagger under our weight.
Yeah. And if you're not a good rider or
Yeah.
a balanced rider, that's even makes it more complicated for the horse to try to balance.
Yeah. And I realized why a lot of green horses will buck or rear or bolt is because the sort of rapid fire of the aids or the
Mhm.
strength of the aids can
Mm,
overwhelm a green horse and they just go blam and push against everything.
right.
And it just is from that sense of the horse being confused or overwhelmed with too much like physical stimulus because all of our aids are words. So it's like we're yelling at the horse with heavy aids, or
Mhm.
we're talking really, really, really fast and they get confused, right? And so really breaking down each aid. And so with a green horse, it's like I'm going to think forward in my body. I'm going to lightly squeeze my calves because now I have an opportunity to never make this horse heavy to the leg.
Exactly.
If I always offer just the squeeze of the calf, that will take on meaning to the horse. And I know that they feel those two things. They feel my energy go forward. They feel a tightening of my calf muscle. And then I need to say to them, that means start back here. That's what the whip is for. Tapping the hindquarter or touching them like we would tap someone on the shoulder. Start from here. And the first few attempts with a green horse might be sideways or backwards, or they might be confused. So there's several different strategies for teaching a horse the leg aid, but ideally, that's how I want the horse to learn to go forward. And when I do rehab work, I go, I'm just restarting a horse that's already been
Yep.
ridden. I'm just going back through a lot of what I do with green horses because the experienced horse that now has either fear issues or massive balance issues has to relearn and really dynamically fill in the holes from the basics. And especially if the rider feels like their horse won't go forward without spurs, I go, we're back to square one.
Yeah.
We're going to have to rebuild that whole forward system now because you first have to resensitize. You have to get the horse to not shut down that
Exactly.
skin sensitivity on their barrel.
And that goes back to that thinking of more is better,
Yeah, and it can be
adding more and more, and it just backfires.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And the whip is just a better tool that sort of extends the reach of our fingertips to go back here, buddy. Start
Mhm.
from back here. And if the horse has a fear of whips, I go, okay, whips can also get misused. They can be
That's true.
perceived as harsh. But then I have to take the time, if the horse has a fear of the whip, to just in the mounting, dismounting process, rubbing the horse with the whip, getting them used to the whip. And then I actually did a whole video on YouTube under the playlist, I think Horse Geeks Hacks,
Okay.
on how the rider should hold the whip. Because the crazy part is, and I had to do a whole video on it, it's not even on a horse, it's just like in my wash rack, teaching people here's how you hold a whip. Because the longer dressage style whips or racing whips actually are easier to touch the hindquarter while you keep your arms and torso stable. But every whip has a handle, and you never hold any whip on the handle. I go, I don't even know why they put a handle on the whip, although it's kind of a counterbalance. But
I think
every,
that's what it is. It's a counterbalance.
yeah. So I have a video on how to find the balance point of the whip. You basically lay it across with your palm up. You sort of lay the whip across your fingertips, and there's a place on the whip where you can balance it on your fingertips. And it's usually just at the base of the handle or a little bit
Mhm.
below the handle. And that's actually where you need to hold the whip in your hand. And then it's easy to just sort of, move your elbow in or move your shoulder out, and the whip is already touching the hindquarter lightly. But I think that's a big reason why people go to spurs instead of whips for forward, is
I
because if you've
I
never been
yeah,
trained how to hold a whip, if you hold the whip by the handle, it tightens your whole
it's
arm.
awkward.
It's so awkward.
So awkward.
Yeah. And then people like forever are throwing the whips on the ground. This sucks. Or if they go faster than a walk and they're gripping the whip on the handle, all of a sudden
Mhm.
that whip starts bouncing. And that the horse thinks, oh, you want me to go faster and faster and faster.
And I think of it too from an Alexander perspective. If we are not a well-balanced rider and we're balancing off our hands when we ride, it makes it very complicated and
Yes.
unsettling to the brain to add one more thing to our very dewy hands.
Yes, exactly. If we're not stable through our
Right.
seat and torso, it gets even more difficult to
Hmm.
manage a riding whip. And that's why people will go to spurs.
Yeah.
Plus, they look so cool.
Is that it?
I think that's most of it, really. The other thing, too, is there's this perception that the English spurs, which are just little nubs of metal, are kinder because they look less torturous than the big Western spurs, which
Right.
have what's called a rowel, which
Hmm.
is the wheelie part with the
Hmm.
spikes around it. But again, if we look at the physics of it, the English spurs actually increase pressure more because you're distributing that force over a much smaller surface area. And the reason they put these big rowels that sound really cool when you walk into the saloon,
Hmm.
right? The reason
Hmm.
they put those on Western spurs is because it dissipates the force over a bigger surface area. And there's little points on the rowel if you need a jagged edge, but the rowel itself being that big and being like a wheel, that actually distributes the forces over a greater surface area.
Mhm.
So the English spur intensifies the force because it's more pounds per square inch of
Mm,
force. Where the wheel on a Western spur, the rowel, is more is sort of dissipating the force because you have the pounds per square inch over a greater surface area.
interesting.
hmm So that's another human perception is that the English spurs are somehow kinder because there's not this big wheel with spiky things on it. But it's actually the opposite. The bigger the wheel on the spur, the more dissipation of force you have against the horse's barrel. And they sound better when you walk around.
I
Tink,
know they
tink,
cling,
tink,
cling.
tink, tink, tink.
Yeah,
Yeah.
haven't worn those in a long time.
No, I wore spurs for a little while, but I ride rehab and young horses, and I realized if I get unseated and that spur
That's
accidentally
deadly.
hits the wrong place,
Yeah,
it
it's
makes a
deadly.
bad situation a lot
Mm,
worse.
yes, I agree.
So I
I
was
agree.
never a big fan of spurs just because if you have a horse that's a little tricky and your leg accidentally bumps that
Hmm.
flank with a spur on a green horse or a defensive horse, all of a sudden you feel the force of that sideways, right? Or that squeezing inward. If the horse isn't going forward, right? And we're squeezing inward or really driving with our seat and leg for a horse's, if the horse's brain isn't going forward and they're not initiating the push from the hindquarter, the more we push or squeeze or create pain issues, that energy is just going to go
Gonna
straight
go.
up.
That's what I was thinking. It's just gonna explode.
Yeah. Like there's
Yeah.
a move in the high school of dressage called levad, which is a controlled rear, right? So the horse goes up on their haunches, not a full rear, but they sort of come up off the ground with their front legs. And one of my horses was very good at it. And the way I taught her to do the levad was I created rain resistance and added a boatload of leg.
Oh my gosh.
And that's how you teach them to rear.
No, thank you.
Yeah, so you restrict the forward motion. It was fun. She got really good at it. And it was quite balanced. She could go up there and kind of hang there and come back down. And like at the, Spanish School of Riding in Vienna, it's one of the what they call the high school moves of dressage, a levad, right? Another one is a courbette, where the horse is rearing and then jumping
Jumping.
forward on both hind legs, right? So to teach a horse to rear, you give them spurs and you hold them back with the reins. That's how you, because that's the energy going up. That's
Yeah,
how you
it's got
get
to go
the energy.
somewhere.
Yeah. And that was sort of the other origin of spurs was in the high school air, what they call airs above the ground,
Hmm.
right? Which is the levad, the courbette, the capriole. The airs above the ground, you could goose a horse pretty hard with the spurs. But again, those were war fighting moves,
Right,
right? In actual warfare on horseback. And then it became in the Baroque area, or the Baroque era, it became the performance,
right.
right? That's when horsemanship sort of became its own thing as an art form versus just practical warfare. And that's what a lot of our horsemanship is based on,
Yeah.
is just that. But it made me think of the Alexander technique too, because what you're using all the time is when you say hands-on guidance,
Hmm.
describe what that is, because I think it's very similar to what we're talking about.
That's what I was thinking. I just trying to figure out how to explain it. It's pretty much if I'm not using myself well, I really can't put hands on and help somebody. So I have to be guiding myself into better biomechanics to help other people. Because if I can't put hands on somebody and pull them down. That's not going to help.
Well, and I think the fascinating thing to me, and what's a little hard to explain about Alexander technique, is I go, it's kind of in the realm of horse whispering. It's
That's a
so,
good way to put it.
yeah, because I go, it's hard to explain to people that when you put hands on people, you're not manipulating like a massage therapist or a
Right,
chiropractor or even a physical therapist. It's kind of
right.
like the horse whispering of body work because
I'll have
you're,
to use that.
yeah, you're literally putting you're just making a contact.
Hmm.
But even us humans who are not so subtle, we feel your intention and direction without you like moving my shoulders around
Right.
or rattling my head around. If you put hands on me, it's that exact same sensation that I'm talking about, that intention to walk forward
Yes, it's the
without the
thought.
without the physical movement.
Yeah.
And there is a tangible wave of force that changes. So the
Yes.
forces of motion, which are invisible, we still feel
Hmm.
right before the physical gesture. And to me, that's where you work as an Alexander instructor.
Yes. Yeah. It's very hard to describe, but that was pretty good.
Yeah. So when you put hands on people, what are you feeling and what are you doing to them and what are you receiving from them? Because it's very much what we can do as a rider with our horses. I find it really, really similar. So can you describe that process of and would you ever bring in spurs or a tap or a whip, or how would you
That's
help
interesting.
someone? How would you help someone understand, which is what I'm doing with a horse? If the horse doesn't understand the light leg aid, I'm clarifying it with a tap
Hmm.
on the hindquarters.
I think you have to be an exceptional teacher. You have to, um, so if I'm engaging with a person and, trying to get some sort of change, I may be in the wrong place or asking the wrong questions of that person. So I'll move on to something else. It's not
It's not inside leg to outside rein every
yeah, it's
time.
not that. Because Alexander always said to start with the head neck relationship. Well, maybe that doesn't work with everybody. Maybe I have to go somewhere else or redirect. And maybe a certain person, it has to be in movement that we find a new way of using the body. Some people can be in a chair. So you just have to be open to all possibilities. But there is, just like with the horse, there is true balance in the human. And we know it's through the spine with the horse and with the human. And so that's my goal, is to always find integrity within the human spine.
Yeah, as the central point of organization.
Yeah.
And so when you put hands on people, how do you know? What are you feeling to know if their spine, if the use of their spine needs some help finding more efficiency or a better mechanical use? How do you know that through your
How do I
hands?
know that? How do I know that?
It's
Years. It's um I'm trying to figure out a way to say it that would be visual, like with a horse. This might help. So if you're looking at a saddle on a horse and it's cocked off to one side, you know that there's an imbalance. So when I'm putting my hands on somebody, I can feel if there is, I guess to make it simple, a pull. Maybe it'll be a pull down, a tightening in, something like that I will feel with my hands.
Or an asymmetry, maybe
Yeah, an
even
asymmetry,
like
maybe,
the saddle going to one side would be an
yeah, that
A.
asymmetry. I will feel that in, right into my hands as soon as I put hands on somebody.
And can you talk about, because this came up in a different conversation we were both in recently, but can you talk about how it's possible that our horse's neck can look straight and we can be on a path of travel that's absolutely straight? Let's say our pattern, our test, whether it's reining or barrel racing or dressage or our jumping course, we can stay absolutely on that path and our horse can look straight but not be straight, still have dysfunctional use of the spine. How is that possible in a body? How is it that a horse can look straight and not be straight? Or a human, let's
Because I
take
don't,
away.
our eye doesn't pick up what's going on internally.
So, what's going on internally that a body could visually look straight, but internally not actually be optimally straight through the spine? What
You,
happens? Because I know it's
um,
possible. I see it all
it's
the
totally
time.
possible. Or you could even go to the person that has scoliosis.
Who looks straight, but the
They
spine
look
is crooked.
straight, and I'll have clients come to me all the time saying, "Oh, well, I have scoliosis," and I'm looking at them like, "Wow, didn't know, wouldn't have known by looking at you," kind of thing. You can have rotations, you can have internal holding patterns and trauma.
So how does
Um,
the body, because what I'm fishing for here is
yeah.
you explained it mechanically the other day really well
Oh, geez.
of how, I'll just remind you, you said something about how when the bony alignment is not correct or efficient, the mechanical sort of bony coordination, that the muscles make up the difference.
Right, you'll go into some sort, it could be any soft tissue is going to go into, like, for lack of a better term, some sort of holding pattern um, to compensate for the misuse of the bones. There's going to be stress in the muscle, ligament, any of the soft tissue
Right.
to maintain uprightness.
Yeah, and maintain functionality.
Yeah,
And so that's why I go, hey, one-legged man can still walk a straight line.
yes,
But there's going to be some tension, right? If they don't have a leg substitute like a crutch, then there's going to be a lot of tension in the body, right?
yeah,
Because it can't be equally balanced.
right.
So I think because I think it's difficult for people to understand that horses that are competing at high levels of competition can be very much out of balance
Hmm.
and really using themselves poorly because there's a way of thinking, and I think this is oftentimes related to grabbing that set of spurs. If we could only get our horse to go forward, then the forwardness would create the balance. But I go, I usually have to turn that around. If we create the
Hmm.
balance, the forwardness is the result.
Right. And it's not just forward, there's got to be a verticality to it too.
Yeah, a three-dimensional body with
Yeah,
balance in three dimensions. But if
yeah,
we're talking spurs and whips, we get frustrated because the horse isn't forward. We call them lazy or dull or they
hmm,
resistant. This horse is a butthead, whatever, right? So that just makes us go to more leverage tools like spurs
that's that thought pattern.
or
Hmm.
get sharper with the whip. And everybody who deals with a lethargic horse is so obsessed with just getting forward. It's like
Only
if
get
I could
this.
only
That's the
push my
aspirin
horse.
theory.
Yes. If I could only get more forward, it would fix all my problems.
Yeah,
But I go, you're not going to get forward as long as forward is cumbersome or uncomfortable or difficult for the
right.
horse. You can ask away, and I've seen it go on between horses and riders for years.
Yeah.
I've seen horses that have sores from the use of the spurs.
I have too.
or bleeding,
Hmm.
right? And even in a dressage test, I was horrified that a lot of people will get disqualified in their dressage test unless the horse is bleeding from the spurs. I
Wow.
go, there's a lot more pain before the bleeding. Like, I just think that to watch somebody bang the horse's side with a spur every stride just makes me cringe.
Yeah.
Just
And to me, that's
absolutely
not a
cringe.
balanced rider.
It can't be a balanced rider, and
No,
it's certainly
they're
not a
balancing
balanced
off their
horse.
hands if that's happening.
Yeah, so a lot of times people are shocked when I go, okay, put your spurs on for the show or when you want to impress your neighbors. But when you train your horse,
Right.
take the spurs off because it will not resolve the problem you're having.
I think it would be dangerous to put the spurs on at the show.
Depends on the horse. But
Whoopee.
if people are super attached to their drop nose band and their curb
Oh my
bit and their
gosh.
spurs, I'm like, okay, put it on for show, but never train with it.
Right.
Because during training, if we're actually training the horse, we need to know what we're working with. And we need to authentically build the forward by improving the balance or the coordination of the body in forward motion. I go, that's a bigger job than just strapping on spurs and
Yeah.
yee-hawing it into a faster speed. So whatever forwardness the horse gives us after the leg aid, I go, that's what we're working with.
Hmm.
So let's channel it a little straighter. Let's build it up slowly until the horse offers more and more
Yeah.
forward energy.
And that's when it's fun, is when the horse initiates the conversation.
Yeah.
I love that. I love it when it gets to that point when I can energetically think walk and it just happens.
Yes.
I love that.
And you know what? I guarantee that's all you need on a
I know.
horse that's really moving in balance and has self-carriage.
Yes.
And self-carriage is sort of the theoretical goal, no matter how you ride, what discipline, what kind of training you do. Everybody knows self-carriage is sort of this ultimate goal of achieving a horse's development, but nobody does it.
No,
Nobody
that
even, I mean, how could you possibly develop self-carriage if you, as a rider, are driving with your seat or banging with your spurs just to maintain a walk or a trot or a
yeah,
canter? There's zero self-carriage if you're the one
I
always
agree.
creating. I go,
Yeah.
so you're every time you're overusing leg aids, whether in harshness or repetition, you're taking away the
Hmm.
horse's job of maintaining forward motion, which is part of self-carriage.
Yeah.
So I go, it makes no sense to me. It's completely illogical, but I could go to a show today and see 9 out of 10 people doing exactly that.
Yeah. It has to change the mindset
Hmm.
to change the
Yeah.
movement.
And
That's pretty much it.
I think sometimes our belief system or the unspoken part of traditional training
Mm.
sort of plants these ideas deep in our subconscious that we don't question.
Yeah.
Like the our somehow the horse figures out or through condition response that our leg aid equals forward.
Hmm.
And I go, there's a dynamic aspect to that too. But legs don't generate forward. Hindquarters generate forward.
Right.
Right? So our legs are either stimulating that forward push of the hindquarter or they're not. But our legs and the rib cage of the horse do not generate forward.
Right.
It doesn't come from there. But that's our thought process.
It is. That's what
So,
we've been taught.
right. So that's why so many people wind up strapping on spurs is because they're thinking leg aid equals forward. I need a
Hmm.
stronger leg aid. I'm out of strength with my legs and my horse still isn't going forward.
Hmm.
And I go, because if you squeeze them like a tube of toothpaste in the middle, there's only going to be a little energy that squirts out the front and then it's done.
Yep.
But you're blocking the energy coming from the back of the
Hmm.
tube of toothpaste by sort of creating that squeeze in the middle.
And there's that whole thought, I see this a lot, the anticipation of the next thing. Take, for example, I want to trot at C. And I can see it in the rider as they anticipate, they're already in the trot in their bodies and the horse isn't trotting yet. So it's almost like you're blocking the
Yes.
movement from happening.
Yes, when we get ahead of the motion with
Yeah.
our mind.
When we think, I mean, it's okay to think ahead, but not to physically go there. And I see that a lot in everybody, that anticipation of even opening a door. You're already setting yourself up 4
Getting,
strides before it.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
you're
you're sort of,
already on the other side of the door and you're thinking. When the
it's the,
horse is like, "That's really confusing."
yeah, or the jump rider who's tight and ahead of the motion.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's happened to me. It's not a
Taking the
good place.
jump.
Yep,
You're
not a good
taking the
place to
jump,
be.
but the horse isn't coming with you.
No, I've been there.
Yeah. And I go, all you do by doing that is you open the back door and you close the front door. So all of a sudden, the horse's energy can suck back and you're ahead of the motion. So you're the one sailing over the jump because you closed the front door with your body.
Yeah, we
And
don't
the horse,
realize that, and that anticipation of the movement is shutting the horse down.
yes, absolutely. And that's how horses constantly escape back door and side doors,
Mhm,
is because the rider's mind, and again, it's reinforced with traditional vocabulary of
mhm,
training the rider that we want to look where we're going. And it's like our eyeballs and our mind are slightly ahead of where our seat and the horse are.
mhm.
And that is absolutely going to block the energy.
Yeah.
Yep. Good point, Deb. Okay, so as you guys can see, not a fan of Spurs. I just go take them off. We don't need them. And they can become quite
Think
torture.
differently.
Yeah,
Think
and even
differently.
especially if someone is listening who's an upper level rider, I'm not trying to insult you. I am trying to let your horse show you that
Mhm,
if the horse is not self-propelled in forward motion or not self-propelled with energetic forward motion, you have a balance problem.
yeah,
You
it's not a
don't,
movement problem.
and it's not bad behavior.
No.
Like so often it gets labeled as a personality defect. My
Mhm,
horse is lazy, right? Or it gets, like, oh, my horse has bad conformation. And I go, both of those, as soon as we tell ourselves that the horse is doing this against me, or the horse is lazy or stubborn or stupid or dull, all of that describes a horse that usually gets spurs.
mhm,
The crazy ones, you don't put spurs on your horse, it's running away. That rider never even thinks to put spurs on. It's
mhm.
always with the horses that lack forward energy. And I go, if you don't build authentic pushing through the mechanical structure of the horse's body, then number one, you're going to be working hard your whole life, your whole riding life. And number
Yeah, you're gonna
two,
sweat.
you're never going to authentically develop self-carriage or what authentic mechanical balance in your horse. It's impossible as
Right.
long as you're doing that. So once you take the spurs off and you give a leg aid, and then you take your leg off once the horse is moving forward, then you know what the horse knows.
Yes.
And that can be a little shock to the system sometimes. It makes some riders very unhappy, and then I get fired.
Yeah.
Because they just think, oh, if I could only get forward, if I could
And
just push my horse harder, at some point my horse will maintain that energy. But I go, not if it's a balance issue.
exactly.
Yeah, they'll only move forward because they're afraid of what you're going to do, but not because they're good at it or they want to.
Right.
And like you said,
We hear that all the time. How come he won't stay for? Or why does he stop? And hear
yeah,
that all the time.
all the
They're
time.
out of balance. They don't know what to do, so they stop.
Yeah, and the thing that sort of makes me laugh a little bit is spurs are most popular in dressage and like Western pleasure, rather like people who do cutting, they might wear spurs for decoration, but they're not using them, right? People who actually work cattle on the back of their horse, cutting or cow work. It's mostly like the overuse of spurs, I find ironically, is in the sports where the forwardness should be self-carriage,
Yeah,
like
and it's not.
dressage. And I go, the obsession of forwardness in dressage riders, ironically, has made that the number one problem in their horse's performance. They lack forward,
Mhm.
which is, it's just ironic to me, but that's where I find most people have lazy horses.
Mhm.
And I go, probably because they've been pushed too much or pushed to go faster than they can balance or pushed constantly or had a pain issue if they didn't go
Right.
forward. So, anyways, I think we should wrap it up there. And if you need to build forward in your quote unquote lazy horse, it's in your seat stability,
Mhm.
your light leg aid, and then a very light tap on the hindquarters. That's how I have to rebuild forwardness in horses all the time.
Mhm.
And it works because it works dynamically.
Yeah.
Wrap it up there.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for joining us, you guys. If you lasted this long, please like, share, subscribe. And we're trying to build up our subscribers on YouTube. So please subscribe. And thank you to all the new subscribers. You are most welcome here. And we love your comments. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.